Good afternoon, Tony Dattino here with you with another Live with Tony, and we're going to be talking about an article that I've read in Discover magazine on spacing, memory spacing. In our Maximum Memory online course, we call those memory rhythms. In the Discover article, their research talks to them about memory spacing. It's the same principle, and so spacing and rhythms basically fit the same, which is when we are in a study mode, or we want to retain something we've read, or we want to retain something we've seen, what are the best spacing in time, so I think of spacing of time, that you should engage in to maximize your ability to encode and then retain and recall that information. So in the Maximum Memory Mastery, I think Michael Dattino has done a fabulous job of really putting in a section that if we understood this when we were in school, and we would teach this to our students that are in school today, would make a dramatic difference in their ability to do far better in their school, tests, exams, comprehension. In a professional world, if we were able to follow this spacing or rhythms of encoding, retaining, and recalling, it would be amazing how much more important information that we wanted to encode would be in our brains to be able to use at a snap, given the right rhythm of when our memories are absorbing and retaining. So let me just take you through this, and it was an interesting article. It totally mirrors exactly what we teach in the Maximum Memory Mastery online course, but even live. We take a whole section out of the Maximum Memory, and we just talk about memory rhythms and what that means to us in terms of our ability to comprehend what we read and not lose focus on it. So brain scientists explain why many of us forget key plots or key comprehension points, or even the endings of where something we've read will take us. And so we read something, and then goes. So this takes me to people in the focus. So the first thing they talk about is your focus and being attentive to something that you want to remember, and not trying to mix 2 or 3 subjects at the same time. So you have to be very clear if you're in a school and you've got 15 credits or you've got 4 or 5 major topics. You want to segregate mentally your study periods for each topic. So if you want to study your history and your psychology and your social sciences and your world geography, you want to study those in very specific increments where you keep them in their respective departments, as I might call it, focus areas, so you're not bleeding them together and therefore running the risk of just muddling up something you might learn about a country and its capital with something about a social study and a leader in a social group, and wonder, gee, what subject was I studying that in? What was I supposed to remember? And what they talk about in this article is how you create amnesia for yourself. Now, it's a nice way of saying how you muddle things up and you cross-section them, and you lose your comprehension of what those key points are because you've crossed them. And so I sometimes see this when I'm trying to remember people's names. I try to think, okay, where did I see this person? Did I stop and focus on who they were and where I saw them? So I had neighbors, for example. I'm at a ball game seeing all kinds of different people, and we're at a high school football game, and here are my neighbors from next door, and I'm looking at them, and they're looking at me like, I think we know one another. And I looked at them and said, yeah, that's James and Margaret. Hey guys, you're my next door neighbor. And they're like, oh God, Tony. it's amazing how we can just look at things and kind of cross them. Here we are at a football game looking at players and people and cheering and what have you, how we muddle those things up. In that same regard, as we're reading, we have different topics and different subjects. What spacing are we creating? What rhythms are we creating in terms of how our memories are going to work? So here's what this suggests. It clearly, this is what I said earlier, we would change our study habits if we only knew the science behind memory rhythms that tell us that, first of all, when we're in reading mode, we don't want to be distracted from the television or radio or somebody talking to us or the phone's ringing or our cell phones texting or something of that sort. So I see some kids sometimes reading, they're reading and you're talking to them, and they're over here on their texting and they're back over here. Like, doesn't work. You stay here, stay with me. Now, what do you do with that? Stay with me. First, are you focused on something that you're trying to encode? So I'm going to use the word encode. Are you focused on what you're reading or what you're hearing, what you're doing on a Zoom? Are you focused on wanting to absorb it in? And that focus may include you having a pencil and paper and just having a blank sheet with you and jotting down key thoughts or key sentences or key point that comes to your mind. When you're reading a book, I read a book with 4 color pens, and I code them by the topics that I'm interested in terms of leadership and teamwork and creativity. I code each of those colors, and as I'm reading, I'm actively engaged. So when I'm listening to someone, I'm taking just keyword notes that jog my memory back to the conversation. So a half hour later, I can go back and look at my keyword notes, and it brings me back to the conversation, and maybe an hour conversation, and I can go ask the appropriate questions that I want to know about in more detail, and then prolong and encode the things I want to grab and take away from the dialogue. So as we're reading, as we're listening, as we're on Zooms, do we have something in front of us where we have a pen and paper and just jotting down key words, key thoughts, maybe a question that comes to mind, and just a quick jot, and back, you're in focus. Now, that's in your paying attention. I want to absorb the points. I'm absorbing what I'm listening or hearing or being a part or reading. Now, you've absorbed it. It's come away. And now what do you want to do? You want to give yourself a break. This is not a 3 or 4 hour cram session where you just cram and cram, rote memory, and you just beat it into your head so that an hour after the exam you forgot the answers. No, this is how do you encode it in a way that now in different spaces of time, call those rhythms, you go back and do a review of this topic, of this subject, an hour later. So you give your memory some space. You absorb, your brain absorbs best in about a 45-minute increment. So for 45 minutes, I absorb, have some key notes. Now I go away. And before I look at my key notes, before I go back to reading the next, I mentally take a mental review and basically a test of myself. What can I recall from what I learned an hour ago? So what were some of the key points of what I had just read? What are some of the key messages I got from my Zoom call? And let me mentally go through that. And then look at my notes and see how I compare with what I mentally recalled and some of the key notes. Maybe I even want to pick up what I read and I want to reread it based on, that I remember all of the key points. So now I've spaced it. So initially I focused and I coded. Now I spaced it and I go back and say, what can I recall? And maybe I even write down what I think I recall. The act of writing it down is extremely important. Now I wrote it down, and now I pick it up again, and let me just go back through and read to see if I retained some of the key points. And when I see some of the points I missed, bam, they get back in there a second time, but a little firmer. They get back in with a little stronger point of view. Repeating similar experiences can help you get through all this, but now I want to read what is suggested here. Now shame on me. Here we go. Repeating items reminds the learner of when it happened before prompting retrieval or trying to recall. But if the repetitions are too close together and the event is still on your mind, you're bypassing the retrieval, which can hinder long-term retention. Researchers are considering how fatigue and reduced attention play into the rapid-fire consumption habits. We scroll from one item to the next, going from one issue, text message, and it's gone and it's lost. So when you're doing this studying, what you want to do is you want to give yourself a few minutes. When I'm doing a class, I may break after an hour and bring people back in a 10-minute break and say, okay, what were some of the key points we just learned in the past hour? And pick up what I want them to retain, review that, maybe throw a few questions out. It's like a quiz. See how people fill in on the pop quiz in the practice mode, see where they missed, and then give them the answers to that, and it helps them to retain far more of what the teaching points are. And then you move on to the next section. Okay, now we're going to go back to focus and attention, keyword notes. We're going to walk away and give that some space. Now we're going to put two pieces together. It means we have to be much more intentional and much more in focus if we want to encode, retain, and recall. And that's what we call memory rhythms. They call memory spacing in this Discover article. That makes a world of difference to professionals when you're learning for new promotions and new tests. So I'm going in 2 weeks to be a keynote at an event where they're going through their technical updates of their technical manuals, and they're going to be tested for it. Now, my recommendation to them will be, as you go through your study periods, keep them into blocks of an hour or less. Take a 5-minute break before you pick up the next hour's segment. Don't go off to distracting things that cause stress. So don't go pick up a phone or go answer a text. Stay focused in that moment, and your 5-minute rest should just be doing as little as possible that creates a stress level in yourself or an anxiety. Stay focused, pick up your text, think about, okay, what did I learn in the last reading that I had in my last study period? Let me relook. Maybe they gave me a test that I can go look at and see how I would be able to do on that test. See what I missed now, go back and fill in the misses, and then go take on the new material. As we teach people what we call this cycle of memory rhythm, memory spacing, it is amazing how much more we are able to comprehend of important information that is essential to our learning, our professions, our academic standing, just by changing what we call our review process, our study habit process, and putting that into sync with the way your brain's memory rhythms are going to help keep it together. Now, I'm talking in the immediate hour, the immediate study period. Let's suppose your test is next week. How about doing the same thing a day later? Let's take a day later. You've studied something today. You really want to retain it for next week. So how about tomorrow, just thinking and stopping and putting yourself into a mental image of thinking about, gee, what were some of the key takeaways of what I learned yesterday? Let me first of all mentally think that through, and even get out a piece of paper and let me jot those things down. Let me engage my hand. So my brain has to communicate to my hand, and now I'm increasing my sensory perceptions and inputs. Let me write those notes down. Then let me go look at what the text is. Maybe there's a test that I need to go back and look at, and I missed some of the questions, but let me look at my notes. Then I'll go back and read from the original source material, and now as I fill in those blanks, it just sticks the information in that much stronger. But that's tomorrow. So now I've done within the hours, I've taken a night off, I come back at it tomorrow. Now what do I want to do? I want to let that go for a few days. But you know what? Maybe in 3 days, I'll come back and do the same process. I promise you, if you follow the cycle of memory spacing / rhythms, it will make a huge difference in your ability to pass exams, professional accreditations, retaining critical information that you need to have for your work. It makes a huge difference in your intellectual capacities and what you're able to achieve. That's going to wrap up my Live with Tony for this week. Enjoy your weekend. I think we've all managed, majority of people have managed to be okay and not get caught in the Elsa storm that just went by us. And we did okay here in the Orlando, Windermere, Florida area. And I hope all my friends on the East Coast, as they traveled up and traveling up to New York, are still safe and being smart. We'll see you on Monday when I pick up my next Live with Tony.